first learned about him when I read The Pleasure Trap he co-authored with Doug Lisle early in my journey with Whole Foods plant-based. I can't tell you how many times I have heard him say, if you're not willing to eat steamed vegetables for breakfast and salad for lunch, well, when I heard that, I knew I had to try it because I was not doing great. His new book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, reveals research statistics in how water only fasting at True North Health Center, which he founded, can treat hypertension and other chronic diseases, which he will tell us more about in our Zoom. He is also a board member for the prestigious and oldest whole plant food diet health organization in the USA, which was founded in 1948, the National Health Association. He graduated from Western States Chiropractic College in Portland, Oregon. Then he traveled to Australia, where he became licensed as an osteopathic physician. And I have to tell you one more thing that he's been talking about, the newer ones that I've been watching, about the energy vampires. And I've been listening to that and in implementing it, getting rid of the energy vampires in my life. And I have to tell you, it has made my recovery from my food addiction so much easier. And even though it's hard to do at first, it makes a difference. He has changed my life, and I am thrilled to present to you Dr. Alan Goldhamer. Thank you, Dr. Goldhamer.
Thank you. So I'm excited to be here today and to share with you some information I hope you'll find of use. And I want to start by talking about the fact that there is a hidden force that undermines people's health and happiness. And this hidden force is essentially responsible for a lot of the chronic illness and obesity that people suffer with today. And understanding this force can give you the ability and the tools and the power to deal with it. And we call it the pleasure trap. Just coincidentally happens to also be the title of our book, The Pleasure Trap, Mastering the Hidden Force That Undermines Health and Happiness. Essentially, a pleasure trap involves the artificial stimulation of a neurochemical in the brain called dopamine. And dopamine is the neurochemical associated with pleasure. Essentially, the more dopamine your brain secretes, the more intense the pleasure you experience. And, this is important from a bioevolutionary viewpoint because the way the brain gets the body to do what it needs to do to survive and reproduce is by rewarding the body every time it engages in behaviors that favor survival and reproduction. And, that's worked well for people, and it's worked well for all the other animals we share the planet with. However, human beings, being the innovative creatures that we are, discovered a way to hack the system, to artificially stimulate dopamine production in the brain. For example, cocaine, methamphetamines, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine. We've gone to inordinate efforts to figure out every possible chemical that can stimulate this dopamine response and generate pleasure. And one of the problems is that it can generate very intense pleasure, which can actually become addictive. And we recognize that one of the hallmarks of addiction is that you're not only taking the substance to try to feel good, but you have to keep taking it to avoid feeling very bad. And people recognize drug addiction is a problem. We say, just say no and, try to avoid it. What we don't often recognize is that there are chemicals that can be put into, for example, the feed that will artificially stimulate dopamine production in the brain and lead to systematic overconsumption. And those chemicals are salt, oil, and sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are not food. They're hyperconcentrated products derived from food that are added back into food to make food taste better. And that's essentially what tasting better is stimulating more dopamine production in the brain. So the better the food tastes correlates with more dopamine production, the more you like it. The problem is when you artificially stimulate dopamine production in the brain, just like with drug addiction, it can lead to an addictive response and systematic overeating. For example, if you take rodents and let them eat ad libitum, so as much as they want of their normal chow, they get to a certain size, then the satiety mechanisms kick in and they stabilize. But if you put these chemicals in the feed of rats, mice, etc., they'll gain 49% of their body weight in 60 days. If you do it with birds, they'll get so fat they can't even fly. And this isn't psychological. This isn't, mommy bird didn't love him enough, or daddy bird loved him too much, or they had to get up and go to work in the morning. This is this is biological. The artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain leads to systematic overeating. And it also works in people. And so what's happened now is that when you put these chemicals in the feed of people, that being salt, oil, and sugar, you will get predictable overeating. Salt, oil, and sugar, SOS, stands for the international symbol of danger, but it also stands for the chemicals added to food that fool the satiety mechanisms and allow people to become overweight. And those are salt, oil, and sugar. Now, the problem is you say, well, okay, so people become overweight, so what? The problem is that for about 10% of the extra fat people add is what's called visceral fat. And visceral fat produces inflammatory markers like TNF alpha and IL-6. And these contribute to a number of chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, autoimmune disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. Now, that makes up around 80% of the people that are dying prematurely. What's interesting about those diseases is they're treated as if they're completely independent. You have to go to a different kind of doctor to even be diagnosed and treated with these conditions. And yet they all have something in common. That is the inflammation associated with excess visceral fat. Visceral fat is hypertrophic, it's hyperplastic, it's hypermetabolic. It acts like a tumor. So a person that, say, has 20 pounds of extra fat in their body probably has around 2 pounds of extra visceral fat. So it'd be like walking up to a person and saying, look, you have a 2-pound tumor in your abdomen that's giving off inflammatory products, increasing your risk factor for chronic degenerative disease. People would take that seriously. Yet in our society, it's not even politically correct to acknowledge that being overweight is a health threat. That's, blaming the victim and, all the things that go along with the psychosocial implications of obesity. During our recent pandemic, one of the big risk factors for dying from COVID infection was how much overweight were you and how much visceral fat you had. And yet that wasn't ever even discussed publicly. That was considered inappropriate. So if you take salt, oil, and sugar and add it to a product, say like potatoes have 500 calories a pound. You put salt, oil, and sugar, turn them into potato chips, now you've got 1,500 calories a pound or more. And as far as your brain's concerned, that's great, because the higher the caloric density, the more dopamine, the more pleasure. Your brain evolved in an environment of scarcity. Its biggest concern is make sure you get enough to eat and don't get eaten. But once you get addicted to the artificial stimulation of these hyper-processed foods, and then you go and try to eat a low caloric density food, high nutrient density food, say like broccoli with 150 calories a pound, all your brain wants to know is where's the richer, more valuable food. The consequence of the dietary pleasure trap is that now 72% of people living in an industrialized society are overweight or obese. If you're not overweight, you're actually abnormal. And you don't want to be normal, you want to be healthy. And once you become addicted to the dietary pleasure trap, or any pleasure trap, including alcohol and drugs, it's extremely difficult to escape. For example, if you become addicted to alcohol and you decide you want to quit and you go to an inpatient program for 30 days and spend $40,000 and you go to 90 visits in 90 days to a 12-step program and you have family support, the likelihood that you'll be drinking again within 12 months is 82%. If you're a heroin addict and you get arrested and you're told you have to do court-mandated inpatient care, the chances that you'll be shooting heroin within 12 months, 90%. Now, this is not really encouraging when you realize 82 to 90% of addicts fail recovery even for a year. But let's take a look at obesity. If you go to a doctor and say, doctor, I'd like you to help me lose 5%, say, of my body weight and keep it off for a year, the likelihood that that's going to happen is 5%. There's a 95% failure rate. If you have a BMI over 40 and you go, the likelihood that you will ever lose that weight, if you're a male, 1 in 1,290 males will ever lose their weight if their BMI is over 40. If you're a woman, the odds are 1 in 667 women will ever lose that weight and keep it off. So that is a 99.99% failure rate. Now, the sobering reality is that a heroin addict has a better chance of beating heroin than an overweight person has of losing their weight and keeping it off using conventional methods. Now, how can that be, and why is that? Let me ask you this. If you treated alcoholism by telling alcoholics to just drink beer and wine, what would the failure rate be? Turns out it's 99%. If you told heroin addicts, well, just use less heroin, what would the failure rate be? Yeah, it's 99%. And what do we tell overweight people? Well, eat less. Put your food on a smaller plate. Chop your food up. Put your fork down between each bite. You won't be overweight anymore. We lie to them. We tell them it's a personality or character defect rather than tell them the truth, which is that they're biologically fooling their brains to satiety mechanisms with the addition of chemicals that some people are more vulnerable to than others to. And those chemicals are salt, oil, and sugar. What percentage of Americans exhibit the 4 most fundamental healthy lifestyle characteristics? That is, they're active, they are a non-smoker, they eat what the American Heart Association says is a healthy diet, which is basically just they include some fruits and vegetables in their diet. And they have, if you're a female, you're less than 25% of your body is made up of fat. And if you're a male, less than 20% of your body is made up of fat. What percentage of Americans do you think meet these 4 most fundamental basic healthy lifestyle characteristics? It turns out it's 2.7%. So that means 97.3% of people don't even meet these most fundamental characteristics of health. In fact, if you look at a chart, this is the self-reported obesity amongst, now obesity means at least a BMI over 30. So you got to be at least 30 pounds overweight if you're 5'4". Self-reported obesity amongst US adults in the United States. So these are all the adults living in these states. You notice on the West Coast, it's around 30 to 35% obesity. As we move east, people get fatter, 40, 45%. There's 3 states, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, and they're aggressively competing right now to see which state can be the first state to achieve 50% obesity saturation. Now, this chart is absolute proof that the folks at the Center for Disease Control are what we call optimists. Because although nobody's quite achieved 50% obesity saturation yet, they're so confident in the American people's capacity to overeat that they put it on the chart here. You see this? 50%. So one of these states any day now is going to break through, and the majority of people will actually be clinically obese. Now, what's interesting is there's actually only one state in the entire country who's, before I go on to that, let me just point out this underreports obesity. This underreports obesity by about 40%, they say, because it's self-reported. And it turns out people lie. And they always lie saying they're thinner than they are, and they never lie saying they're fatter than they are. And there's only one state in the entire country whose self-reported obesity is less than 25%, and that is Washington, D.C., which means the people that live in Washington, D.C. are the smallest overeaters or the biggest liars. Whoop. Okay, so 93% of the calories that's consumed by people living in the United States now comes either from animal foods or pleasure trap, ultra-processed, highly processed foods, so salt, oil, sugar, products. 7% come from fruits and vegetables, but a third of that is one vegetable called potatoes, served mostly as potato chips or French fries. which means fruits and vegetables no longer make a statistically significant percentage of the diet of most people living in this country. Vegetables are like, the ketchup on your kid's school lunch program. As a consequence, the leading causes of death in this country are heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And we spend billions and billions of dollars waiting for people to get heart disease, cancer, and stroke, and then fruitlessly trying to, futilely trying to treat them with stents and bypass and expensive drugs, which actually don't have much reduction in all-cause mortality. Rather than continuing along this ridiculous path, what we should do, in my opinion, is change to focusing on not on the leading causes of death, but the actual causes of death, the reason people get heart disease, cancer, and stroke, which turn out to be the use of tobacco, alcohol, and diet, and particularly animal-based diet that's high in ultra-processed foods. If we put more of our attention dealing with the actual causes of death, we could delay or defer or avoid the leading causes of death. But instead, what we do is tell people to eat health foods like olive oil and red wine and dark chocolate, coffee and coconut, diet sodas, white meat, low-fat dairy. We tell people to eat the Atkins paleo type keto diets that are high in fats, and rather than actually getting people to eat healthy foods. You notice health foods and healthy foods have nothing to do with each other. Healthy foods are fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, a whole plant food diet free of SOS, salt, oil, and sugar. So the solution, eating an exclusively whole plant food diet free from added salt, oil, and sugar. Making sure you don't eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed at night so that you can get 7 to 8 hours of high quality sleep. And exercising. And for those trying to lose weight, you might try to make sure that you maybe extend your nightly fasting by doing some exercise in the morning before you have breakfast. So the diet would look like this. It would be whole, fresh fruits and vegetables, raw and cooked, non-glutinous grains, beans, a few nuts and seeds, and adequate water intake. So a whole plant food diet free of added salt, oil, and sugar. Now, this may seem quite challenging, but when you think about it, human beings for the last 200,000 years have eaten whole plant foods. That's what people ate up until about 200 years ago, when we had the Industrial Revolution. We began to transform our diet into what it is today, which is as much as 70% of calories coming from ultra-processed foods. Now, the consequence of that has been devastating, and I want you to look at this next picture very carefully and tell me if you can spot the difference. Because the difference is the reason people are fat, sick, and miserable. It's the reason we have cardiovascular disease. And so I know this sounds rather radical, radical being the word radicus, which comes from root or cause. So it is. But I'm suggesting we transform from eating this diet back to eating this diet. Now, we've already acknowledged that it's very difficult to do that because people are addicts. They're addicted to the artificial stimulation of dopamine in their brain that comes from ultra-processed foods, and the likelihood of them being able to do that is low. Their success rate is small because addiction is so difficult to overcome. There is a tool, it's an ancient practice that has been proven to make this transition easier, and that is fasting. Fasting has gained some notoriety of recent times. Now, I've been doing this for 40 years at the True North Health Center. But recently, in large part because of people like Walter Longo and others publishing on the use of intermittent fasting, fasting has gained quite some notoriety. It's gone from being criminal quackery to cutting-edge research. And we've been advocating time-restricted feeding for 40 years, which is basically don't eat 3 to 4 hours before going to bed at night. And if you're trying to lose weight, you might even delay breakfast until you've had a chance to do some exercise and preferentially burn fat. There's all kinds of alternate day fasting and different programs that Valter, Longo, and others have advocated. But what I want to talk to you today is about actual fasting, water-only fasting, like we do at the True North Health Center, where we fast people up to 40 days on water only. Fasting is, by definition, the complete abstinence from all substances except pure water in an environment of rest. And there's a number of mechanisms by which fasting is thought to be effective. One, when people fast, they lose weight. Not surprisingly, when you don't eat anything, the laws of physics and thermodynamics tell you you're going to lose weight. And in fact, you lose about a pound a day. Now, that weight consists of water, fiber, glycogen, fiber, and protein. What's interesting about fasting is that the weight loss in fasting preferentially focuses on fat in general and visceral fat in particular. And as we'll see from studies we've done with DEXA scanners and other things, body composition actually changes and you're transforming preferentially the elimination of fat because the water, fiber, glycogen, and protein are recovered shortly after the termination of fasting. Fasting also causes natriuresis, that is the selective elimination of sodium from the body. The excess sodium that's intimately associated with highly processed foods causes the body to retain fluid. It increases the blood volume, therefore the blood pressure. It contributes to problems like congestive heart failure and non-healing wounds. It makes your joint pain worse, etc. When you go on a fast, you go through natriuresis. The body eliminates the excess salt, the excess fluids. Blood pressure normalizes, joint pain goes away, non-healing wounds start to heal. It's really quite dramatic. People are also surprisingly quite toxic. If you take a fat biopsy of a human being today, you'll find there's hundreds of different chemicals accumulated in that body. PCBs, dioxin, pesticide residues, heavy metals. It's quite astonishing the variety of chemicals that are found in people's cells. Some of it got there because they breathe the air, they drink the water, but most of it gets there because they eat the food, and particularly animal foods. Meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products biologically accumulate the toxins from the environment into their own tissues. And when you kill and eat the animal or drink its products, like milk, you get biologically concentrated toxins so that a calorie of vegetable foods compared to a calorie of animal foods, the animal food may have anywhere from 2 to 1,000 times the concentration of toxins that the plant's food have. And so just going on a vegan diet does one big thing, which eliminates one of the primary sources of the toxicity. In fasting, the body rapidly mobilizes and eliminates these toxins. In fact, this is so rapid and so intense, it can be quite uncomfortable sometimes as your mouth coats up and tastes like something crawled in there and died, and you get fasting rashes and discharges. Some people say it's dangerous because the body doesn't know what it's doing. So you should never fast unless you take their proprietary products. So if you buy their pills and potions, then apparently it's safe. But that's not our experience at all. Fasting can be done in appropriate patients, can be done safely and effectively. And in fact, I'll prove to you today by revealing some of the results of a fasting safety study that we published in the peer-reviewed literature. Enzymes are induced during fasting, both for detoxification. In other words, that's how the toxins get out of the body, is the body produces enzymes that grabs onto them and eliminates them. But also that's how fat is mobilized, and protein and glycogen. You have to have fat. You can't mobilize your fat unless you produce lipolysis, so an enzymatically driven system. That's how the fat is mobilized. In fasting, the body has to rely on fat as a primary source of fuel, so it induces these enzyme systems. And what's interesting is the enzyme systems persist after fasting. So you're not just losing weight easier during fasting, but in the weeks and the months and the years after fasting, and apparently it's cumulative. So when you do intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding, even if it's just 12 to 16 hours a day, every day, day after week after month, cumulatively, that is thought to induce these detoxifying and fat-mobilizing enzyme systems, making you more efficient at getting rid of that damaging visceral fat. Insulin is a hormone. It drives sugar from the bloodstream into the cells where it's needed as your principal fuel. If there's resistance to that insulin, your blood sugar levels rise, and we call that diabetes. That's what diabetes mellitus is. Insulin resistance. Diabetics have more insulin, not less insulin, than people that are not diabetic. But the insulin doesn't work because of insulin resistance. And the things that cause insulin resistance is actually the diet that makes you fat. The diet that makes you fat causes insulin resistance. So it's not just the obesity itself, but also the diet, because the moment you change the diet, you have to also start modifying medications and managing diabetes, because as soon as you change the diet, the body starts healing itself. And so long before all the fat is gone, blood sugar levels can normalize. And about 80% of our type 2 diabetic patients are able to achieve normal blood sugars without medications. And those that are willing to do dangerous and radical things like eat well and exercise and go to bed on time can sustain those results. The gut is a tunnel from your mouth to your anus. If you think about digestion, you're shoving stuff in one hole up here, and it goes down the esophagus, and then it goes into your feeding bag or the stomach, and then it moves on to the small bowels and the large bowels, and then it gets to the rectum, and eventually you try to push it out the other hole at the other end. So that's essentially what digestion is, shoving stuff in one hole and then trying to push it out the other hole. It's not absorbed into the body unless it gets absorbed through the intestinal mucosa. That membrane is like a screen that keeps flies out. If the holes are smaller than the flies can't get in. But if something damages the intestinal mucosa, it's like tearing the screen. That something can be free radicals that cause oxidative damage. Now you get what's called gut leakage. Stuff leaks in, proteins and microorganisms. And in genetically vulnerable people, the immune system can overreact, and now we have autoimmune disease, where your body's immune system is actually attacking your own tissues, like arthritis, like ulcerative colitis, like systemic lupus erythematosus, like vasculitis, etc. All these itis conditions are essentially all aggravated by gut leakage, where inflammatory markers from the diet cause the gut to leak, and now you've got alterations in your immune response. Also, depending what you eat depends on how many organisms live in your gut and what those organisms are. For example, meat eaters have completely different microbiome than plant eaters. Meat eaters have microbiome that produce something called TMA, which becomes TMAO, which is trimethylamine oxidase, which causes colon cancer and heart disease. Plant eaters have a different microbiome and different waste products from that microbiome, so they're producing vitamin K and things you actually need. When you think about 5 pounds of creatures living in your gut, 1,000,000,000,000 organisms living, breathing, and defecating inside you, what they poo in you, to a large extent, can influence your health. And what they poo in you is determined by what you feed them. So if you feed them a plant-based diet, you'll have different organisms with different poo than if you feed them an animal-based diet. And that's why people on animal-based diets have so much higher death rate and debility. The autonomic nervous system is what controls all the stuff in your body you don't think about. Like, for example, if you went out running and your heart didn't speed up to pump more blood, you would die. But people don't die because they forget to tell their heart to speed up. It does it automatically. It's controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which has 2 parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And those parts have to be in balance. If they're out of balance, you have problems. Like, for example, if the sympathetic nervous system tone is set too high, you have constipation. If the parasympathetic tone is set too high, you have diarrhea. So what keeps that stuff in balance? We've actually come up with hundreds of healing systems to try to get our autonomic nervous system in balance. For example, massage, biofeedback, meditation, homeopathy, chiropractic manipulation, osteopathic manipulation, meditation, etc. How do these seemingly completely unrelated therapies all make us feel better? And they work to the degree that they balance the autonomic nervous system out. You know, some work better than others, but basically all of these mechanisms by which natural therapies make people feel better tend to focus on their impact on the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Well, in my experience, the most powerful way to rebalance the autonomic nervous system is fasting. Fasting's like taking a computer. You know, the computer's not working. You don't know what's wrong. You shut it off. You turn it back on. You don't know why, but now it's working better. You've kind of flashed your memory. You've rebooted the system. Well, that's essentially what fasting does. It's like shutting the system down. There's a big die-off in the microbiome. When you turn the system back on after fasting, assuming you're feeding it properly, you get to grow a normal microbiome. You go through rapid weight loss, particularly visceral fat, and lo and behold, the body's able to go back to function normally, not the least of which is normalizing the autonomic nervous system balance. Is it interesting that the Jews, the Jains, the Muslims, the Buddhists, the Christians, they don't all agree on everything, do they? But they do all have one thing they agree on, which is there's all have a strong tradition about the role that fasting plays for physical and spiritual health. And there's a reason, because fasting changes the way you feel about yourself and the world around you. The immune system has come into the forefront recently. In 2016, Yoshinori Ishimi won the Nobel Prize for Medicine for recognizing the role that autophagy plays in health. Autophagy is how the body immune system goes in there and eats up cancer cells. You know, the theory is that everybody's getting cancer every day, and if you eat up the cells faster than they are produced, you stay healthy. If they're producing them faster than you eat them up, you grow tumors and then you get sick and die. So autophagy is how the body kind of keeps us healthy and how it gets rid of aged cells and recycles those materials. And it turns out autophagy is profoundly influenced by fasting. And that may be one of the reasons we're seeing some of the dramatic healing that we do in fasting is because of mechanistic changes that allow autophagy to be increased in patients that fast. And perhaps the most obvious is taste neuroadaptation. When people are addicted to the pleasure trap diets of salt, oil, sugar, highly processed foods, they lose their desire for whole natural foods. Fruits and vegetables become disgusting, tasteless swill. They're not interested in that. They only want the artificial, concentrated foods that they're addicted to. But when you fast, your body goes through a neuroadaptation where eventually good foods start to taste good again. And it's really one of the more powerful tools we use to get people back on a healthy diet. Because of taste neuroadaptation, good foods start to taste good again. You know, as I said before, it's like rebooting a computer. Now, this was demonstrated very clearly by a gentleman that we had referred to our clinic. We became a fully covered medical benefit for one of the big labor unions, the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 3, who made any member of their union that had diabetes or hypertension could come to the center at no cost, and we would be able to do our program with them. And we were very excited when we got this contract. It's, you know, very powerful labor union. And the first person they sent over to us was a diabetic hypertensive. So he had blood pressure of 220/120, capped out on 5 meds, diabetes. He had about a 75-pound belly on him. And they sent him over, explained to me he couldn't operate the crane until he got his blood pressure down. But they didn't tell him what the program was. So he showed up at our center and started looking around. And he was like, "Oh, no, 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 no. This is there's a mistake." And I said, "No, there's no mistake. Your name's on the list. You know, you're here to get well." He goes, "No, I'm not sick." I said, "What do you mean you're not sick? You're diabetic and hypertensive. Your blood pressure is 220/120. You're capped out on medications." I said, "You're not only sick, but you're going to die." And he said, "Well, aren't we all going to die?" Which, I mean, you know, is a valid point. But I said, "Look, you know, you're on $880 a month worth of medications. If we get you healthy, you won't need those medications." And he said, "What do I care? I don't pay for the medications. My union does." And so at this point, I realized this is not my normal, highly self-selected, highly motivated True North Health patient. But I'm feeling kind of desperate because, you know, this is the first guy we got from this contract. I don't want to strike out. So I started thinking about his condition, and I realized he's a diabetic hypertensive male on a handful of pills. What do we know about diabetic hypertensive males that are on high medication? They have often a little problem. And so I said to him, I said, "You know, if we get you off all those meds and get you healthy, there's a good chance that we can help you with your little problem. And he started to stand up and he said, well, why the, I'm thinking, uh-oh, because he's a pretty big guy. He's a lot bigger than I am. And he says, why the hell didn't you just say so? So got his attention. We're starting to talk about his diet. He's telling me he's a triple cheeseburger guy, that he lived at least two times a day. He would have triple cheeseburgers, but if they made a mistake and put any lettuce on it, he would take that off and throw it away because he didn't eat rabbit food. So we know we have to feed him before we start fasting him, because if you take a person and you put them on triple cheeseburger diet and put them right on a fast, those triple cheeseburger remnants are going to turn into a brick, which means somebody would have to manually disimpact them, and I didn't want that somebody to be me. So we gave him some food from the True North Health salad bar and hot bar, and he was trying to eat the food, but he couldn't eat the food. He was trying to eat it, but he couldn't swallow it. He was like, and I'm thinking, oh my God, he must have an esophageal tumor. He can't swallow. And I sat down with him. I said, it looks like you're having trouble with the food. And he said, what food? He said, this is not food. He said, this is disgusting. And if I have to eat tasteless swill like this, I'd rather just die. He said, why don't you go out to my truck and you get my 12 gauge? And when I'm not looking, just shoot me in the head. So we checked him in. He ended up fasting 26 days. He lost 50 pounds, got off of his medications to normalize his blood sugar and his blood pressure. What was really interesting, though, is when I sat down with him after his fast, he was actually eating the food. And I said, it looks like you're doing better with the food. And he said, yeah, your damn chef's finally getting the hang of it. It took me 20 minutes to convince him it was the same food. He said, no, the stuff you gave me when I came in was disgusting. He said, this is not bad. I saw him 6 months later at a semi-annual. And I said, how you doing? And he said, I'm doing just fine. And so I learned you got to talk to people about things they care about, and death and that stuff isn't usually one of them. So fasting is interesting because it has some things it decreases and some things it increases. For example, glucose and insulin, as we've talked about, go down with fasting. And IGF-1, which is insulin growth factor 1, goes down. The lower your IGF-1, essentially, the longer you're going to live. Leptin goes down, which is why inflammation goes down. And that's why you see people come in with terrible pain, but by the time they're fasting a few days, their joint pain starts going away. They feel like it's a miracle. It's really nothing more than a biological adaptation to fasting. Blood pressure and heart rate go down. And as you'll see from studies that we'll be sharing with you in a few minutes, we have the largest effects that have ever been shown in treating high blood pressure in human beings in a study we published with T. Colin Campbell from Cornell University. mTOR, which is mammalian target of rapamycin, goes down, and the lower your mTOR, the higher your autophagy. And that may be why autophagy goes up in fasting, because mTOR goes down. The microbial load in the gut goes down as you reboot your microbiome. Inflammatory markers like IL-6 and TNF-alpha go down, which is why inflammation and oxidation go down. And fasting is associated with a resolution of all of the symptoms associated with metabolic syndrome, which is essentially, when people have increasing bellies and blood glucose and blood sugar levels, the syndrome that basically is killing almost everybody you know. Those symptoms, including cholesterol and triglycerides and all that stuff, go down with fasting. Now, fasting increases some things too, like adenopectin and ghrelin. And as those go up, that improves insulin sensitivity and reduces inflammation. AMPK goes up, that's activated protein kinase, and that downregulates something called PGC1 alpha, which is peroxisome proliferator activator receptor. And that results in increased mitochondrial biogenesis. That means the energy producing components inside the cells actually increase, which may be why the chronic fatigue and a lot of the other symptoms resolve in fasting. BHB, which is beta hydroxybutyrate, is the fuel that your brain changes to burning when you're fasting. And the higher your BHB, the more you produce what's called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's what stimulates nerve growth and protects the brain from dementia. It's interesting, there were studies done. If you give genetically bred rats in two groups, one exactly the same diets, exactly the same cages, but you put a wheel in half of the rats so that they can exercise, the rats that have the wheel will exercise and they do not get dementia. And they wanted to know why. Why does exercise prevent dementia? And it turns out when you exercise, you increase BDNF, which is the chemical that prevents your brain from getting oxidative damage from free radicals. Well, the other thing besides exercise that increases BDNF is fasting profoundly. In fact, if you take rats and you periodically fast them, you double their lifespan. They live twice as long and they don't get dementia. So interesting that exercise and fasting often induce the same biochemical changes. And you might think, well, that's weird because in fasting, you're resting and exercise, you're vigorous. But what do fasting and exercise have in common that cause the same biochemical changes in the body? Well, I'm going to suggest that what they have in common is the elimination of fat, and particularly visceral fat. That's what they both have in common, and that's probably why they both are effective at inducing some of these cardiometabolic risk factor changes. Insulin sensitivity goes up in fasting, so the insulin starts working better because you've eliminated the diet that makes you fat and the extra fat cells, and so insulin gets to go back to working properly. Cellular stress resistance and adaptation reflects the fact that in fasting, healthy cells are more protected from damage, like from chemotherapy. And cancer cells, which require a high glucose environment, are more vulnerable to chemotherapy and to the immune system. And this may explain why we're seeing the results we're seeing in cancer, which I'll be sharing with you in a few moments. As I mentioned, autophagy is enhanced during fasting, consistent with the work of Yoshinori Ashumi, who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2016. And the gut microbiome diversity and the stimulation of B-cell immunity, we've already discussed, the idea that the gut flora changes with fasting. According to Walter Longo, published in the Journal of Metabolism in 2015, the combination of fasting and chemotherapy results in dramatically higher cancer-free survival than chemotherapy alone. Walter Longo published a book actually on fasting, mostly about intermittent fasting. And he mentioned in the book a caution about long-term fasting, like we advocate at the True North Health Center. He said, don't do that because it's too dangerous unless you do it at the True North Health Center. Now, since I evaluate other researchers' intelligence based on how much they agree with me, that comment makes Walter Longo a genius. Is fasting really safe? Can you really take people for 40 days and put them on water only and, have them survive and thrive? So to answer that question requires a fasting safety study. And we did, in fact, complete the first long-term fasting safety study published in Biomedical Central and in 2018, where we took 5 years of patients that underwent fasting and evaluated every symptom of every patient every day according to the common terminology criteria for adverse events from the American Cancer Society. So every patient was giving a rating for every symptom, 1 and 2, which are the mild symptoms you'd expect to see with fasting, the headache, the low back pain, the skin rash, etc. Grade 3 are significant medical events. Most of these are hypertensive crises. That's anytime blood pressure goes over 160. 4 would be serious events where if you didn't intervene, it could be serious or life-threatening. And 5, most obvious, is death. And so what we found in people that underwent fasting, there were 5,961 adverse events, most of which, as you can see, are category 1 and 2, which were to be expected. Most of the category 3 events, as I said, were hypertensive crises. And you might wonder, why would a person have a hypertensive crisis in fasting if you're supposed to be using fasting to treat hypertension? And here's how it works. If the patient comes in with blood pressure of, say, 220, and the next day it's down to 200, and the next day it's down to 190, and the next day it's down to 180, and the next day it's down to 170, every one of those days is an adverse event. Even though it's clearly getting better, this is an arbitrary standard. It doesn't matter about causal relationship. It's just anytime you measure a blood pressure over 160, that's an adverse event. And 95% of these category 3 events are, in fact, people whose blood pressure is coming down, or people whose blood pressure was, say, 155, and we discontinue the medication, it goes to 160, and then overall it comes down. So category 4 event, only 1 patient in this group, 0.1%. This was a hyponatremic event. That means the blood sodium went too low. Now, fortunately, we monitor that, so all you do is give the person some juice. But the point is, if you weren't monitoring, it could have become a serious problem. and that's why monitoring is necessary. And there was no death. So we were able to take all these patients, and most of the symptoms, as I said, are the symptoms you expect to see in fasting. But there are people that are not good candidates for fasting. If you're pregnant or lactating, you don't want to be fasting because you'll lose your milk production. If you have anorexia nervosa, a neurological condition where you think you're very fat, but you're actually emaciated, that's not a good candidate for fasting. If you're a type 1 diabetic, which is the type of diabetes where you no longer make insulin because mommy gave you milk products when you were a child and your body's immune system destroyed your islets of Langerhans, then you wouldn't be able to fast because you need insulin to be able to adapt to fasting. If you've had a recent stroke, myocardial infarction, pulmonary embolism, or DVT, or you have cardiac instability or atrial fibrillation, you're likely on anticoagulant therapy. You don't fast on drugs, and particularly not those drugs, because the drugs can become potentiated and create a mass. So we'd have to do a modified fast in order to be able to allow you to continue the medication until you're healthy enough that they can be discontinued. If you have severe kidney disease, you wouldn't fast because you need kidney function in order to be able to clear the toxins eliminated by fasting. If you have a genetic defect like MCAD, which is medium chain acetylcoenzyme A dehydrogenase deficiency, you wouldn't fast because you couldn't break down fatty acids. 1 in 10,000 people have that condition. We test everybody so we don't fast them. If you have deficiency, depletion, or cachexia, or you can't safely discontinue your medications, water-only fasting wouldn't be for you. If you can't rest, you don't fast. People say, well, why don't I exercise while I fast? Wouldn't I lose more weight? Yes, you would lose more weight, but that weight wouldn't be made up of fat. It would be made up of muscle. So we need to rest when we're fasting to maximize fat loss and minimize lean tissue mobilization. Because once you use your glycogen stores, the only place you get extra glucose would be the breakdown of muscle tissue. So conditions that are favorable to fasting are obviously the conditions of dietary excess. If you've got fat and visceral fat, then you want to fast to get rid of the excess fat and visceral fat. If you have conditions that are associated with that, like high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, fasting may be the most effective way of normalizing those conditions. If you have certain types of cancer, like lymphoma, we've shown that lymphoma responds to fasting, as I'll share with you with some case reports in a few moments. If your gut's disrupted and you have GI symptoms, the Crohn's, the colitis, etc., irritable bowel syndrome, these conditions respond well to fasting. If you have autoimmune disease where your body's attacking itself, like rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, ankylosing spondylitis, Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, these conditions are conditions that respond well to fasting. And if dependence, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or caffeine or cocaine, toxicity or fatigue or pain are involved, fasting has been shown to be safe and effective. Fasting duration ranges from 2 to 40 days. Average fast 1 to 3 weeks, and some patients do require multiple fasts depending on the nature of their condition. So this was the first paper that we admitted to treating any type of cancer in, and this was water-only fasting and exclusively plant-based diet in the management of stage 3 low-grade follicular lymphoma. This was published in the British Medical Journal Case Reports. Involved a 42-year-old woman with stage 3 grade 1 follicular lymphoma. She'd been tracked for 2 years, had an excisional biopsy that confirmed the diagnosis, and was told by her doctor that diet didn't matter, she could eat whatever she wanted, and that fasting was criminal quackery. But despite that medical support, she decided to come to True North Health Center and underwent 21 days of water fasting, during which time both her upper and lower extremity tumors disappeared. And so we fasted her for 21 days. We sent her back to her oncologist. And it was interesting. She said he examined her and he couldn't find any tumors. And then he looked at the chart, I guess, checking the picture to make sure he had the right patient. And then he asked her what happened. And she said she went to the criminal quacks and she did the fasting and the tumors went away. And he was very surprised, but he could see the evidence. And he mentioned to her that she was still a bit hyponatremic, that her white count was low, and he suggested that they start chemotherapy. She denied that, and we continued to follow her, and at a year, her white counts had completely normalized. And at that point, we submitted our case report to the British Medical Journal, and eventually it was published. But they said, look, why don't you track her for 3 years? Because sometimes with chemotherapy, the tumors go down, but then they come back worse than ever. And we want to see, can you actually keep her healthy for 3 years? So I explained to the patient that we needed to track her for 3 years, and we needed her to stick strictly to the whole plant food, vegan, SOS-free diet. I said if she didn't stick strictly to the diet, it could be fatal because I would track her down and kill her. And she believed me, and she stuck to the diet diligently, maintained her weight loss, and at 3 years, we were able to do a whole body CT and found that she was still completely cancer-free. And then we submitted this article back to the British Medical Journal at their invitation, and they rejected it. At first, they said, oh, well, maybe she just got lucky. We appealed to the editor, who then said, no, we're publishing it. Very controversial, and showed that she was able to sustain a 3-year outcome without any recurrence. Then what we did is we continued to follow this patient, and at 10 years, we were able to demonstrate she would continue to remain cancer-free, and that now I have her, she's farther in now, and she continues to be cancer-free. Now, she happened to go public with her story, and so we got a lot of lymphoma patients being referred to True North Health Center, and so we were able to track a number of those patients and get long-term follow-up data, and we published what's called a case series, which is the next step in scientific evolution. So we did the case report. Now we did a case series. We did her 10-year follow-up. Then we got a second patient who had failed chemotherapy. So he went in for chemotherapy, but it failed, and now his cancer was spreading. And we wanted to see would he respond, even though he'd already undergone the damaging effects from chemotherapy, but he responded very well too. Again, 21 days of fasting, and we follow-up surveillance, and had significant improvements. And then we got a third patient. This was even more severe. This patient had already had metastasis into their bones. And their oncologist was very antagonistic about fasting and thought it would make him weak and vulnerable. But nonetheless, despite his oncologist's admonitions, he came in and underwent a 21-day water fast. And then he went back to the oncologist, who did follow-up scans and saw that he went from this to this. And he said, oh my goodness, you need to go back and do more of that fasting. And so he came back after recovering, and he underwent 39 days water fasting. Only this time he went from this to this to this. And now what's exciting is this patient has continued to make progress, and we've now been able to successfully publish this case series, which is the next step will be a clinical trial where we divide a group of patients randomly in half. Half of them come into the center and get well. The other half follow the conventional medical stuff and stay sick. And then we can follow up, long-term and see which is better, staying sick or getting healthy. Other things we see, this is an example of a patient who had a lesion on her face. This was not a cancerous lesion. This is a seborrheic keratosis, but nonetheless was reluctant to have the surgery because you can get scarring and whatnot. And this isn't what we were treating her for. We were treating her for hypertension, which, as you can imagine, responded. But one of the side effects was that this lesion fell off of her face. And so not only did she normalize her blood pressure, but she also got rid of her lesion without having to have surgery. So that was nice. This patient, this group of patients, we wanted to use a DEXA scanner to analyze their body composition. We wanted to find out what happens to the body composition. Because people say, well, you on a fast, you lose weight, you gain it back, and there's not a net loss and whatever. So we took these patients, these happen to be males, 15 to 20 days of fasting. And during that time, they lost 8.7% of their entire body weight. They lost 17.8% of their entire fat, but they lost almost 40% of all of their visceral fat. Because like a tumor, the body preferentially goes in there and deals with that tissue first. Now, they did lose 6% of their lean tissue, but by 6 weeks of follow-up, all of the lean tissue was replenished and then some. As a percentage of their total mass, their lean tissue was actually higher at 6-week follow-up than it was even at the end, at the baseline before fasting. We wanted to know what happens in healthy people that fast. Can healthy people fast? And do they get any benefit, or does it only help sick people? So we started recruiting healthy people, people that were metabolically healthy. And it was interesting. It was really easy to recruit sick people. Like there's so many high blood pressure and diabetic patients and people with lymphoma. It turned out to be incredibly difficult to recruit healthy people because there aren't very many healthy people. Only 12% of the entire population is metabolically healthy, and many of them have health problems that excluded them from inclusion in this study. We finally got so desperate to find a few health people that we had to start recruiting from our staff because they're living and working at the True North Health Center, and they were actually healthy. So we finally did get enough people to do this study. And you'll notice their blood pressure started off very nicely at 110. Their weight was good. Their cholesterol was good. They were healthy people. But we fasted them for a period of 5 to 14 days. And then we followed them up to find out what happened at 6 weeks follow-up. And as healthy as they were to begin with, their weight started at 124. At 6-week follow-up, they were actually stabilized at 116 pounds. They had lost 8.1 pounds, mostly of fat. People that were, you can see the total mass, and then you see the mass, this is lean mass before fasting, goes down during fasting, but then recovers after fasting, whereas the fat loss continues. Look at systolic blood pressure. They started at 110. That's a very healthy blood pressure, but at 6-week follow-up, they were stabilized at 106. And that difference translates to a 4% reduction in all-cause mortality. Cholesterol was okay to start with. It was even better, as was glucose. As a percentage of change, it turns out that as healthy as fasting is for sick people, it may be even more healthy for healthy people. The people that ultimately may get the most benefit of fasting are the people that are using short-term fasting preventatively. This was an interesting patient. This patient had gone on a vegan diet but developed abdominal pain. And all of their relatives who were grossly overweight told the patient that it was probably because they were on that damn vegan diet. They probably had protein deficiency or something. That's probably what was making them sick. And they needed to go back to eating normal foods instead of all that plant-based stuff. But when they went to the doctor, it turned out actually they had a tumor. And they also had not only a retroperitoneal mass, but they had hydronephrosis, urotectasis, they had a kidney cyst, and they needed to do a biopsy to tell if this was a cancerous tumor or if this was a fibrotic tumor. Either way, they were going to recommend surgery. But the doctor, because it was in such a delicate place, they had a doctor they wanted to do the biopsy, and he wasn't available, so we had a month before they could schedule the biopsy. And during that time, we underwent 13 days of fasting, 11 days of feeding, had a carefully controlled follow-up. The person lost weight from 232 to 217. They dropped their blood pressure from 164 to 124. And as far as the tumor went, the tumor reduced so much there was nothing left to biopsy. So it saved them the biopsy, and we were able to publish that outcome data. This patient was a dentist that went to a continuing ed event, got hit in the head by one of those tent poles, that fell, and she got her head injury, and as you can imagine, had a headache. The problem was she developed a dural tear, and the headache persisted for 16 years. She had 16 years of constant unrelating headache every day, every moment of every day for 16 years. And then came in and underwent fasting. For the first 19 days, she had no benefit. She still had constant daily head pain. But on the 19th day, she woke up, and for the first time in 16 years, she had 5 minutes of no head pain. Only lasted 5 minutes, then the head pain came back. But by the time we were done fasting her 41 days on water only, she was out of pain. We refed her, and she didn't have any frank head pain, but she was getting little bits of prodrome. So we refed her for 6 months, then brought her back in and fasted her again for 40 days. So this was a second 40-day fast, after which time she had no headaches. And then we demonstrated 3-month, 5-year, and 10-year follow-ups. And in fact, I saw this woman a week ago, and she continues to be headache-free. You can see not only did she get rid of her headaches, but she obviously normalized her blood pressure, her weight, and other issues. And now she's been very compliant. She's sticking to the whole plant food SOS-free diet. This patient had psoriasis. His doctor assured him that diet didn't matter. Psoriasis wasn't a diet thing. 28-year history of having chronic plaque psoriasis, taking every kind of steroid medication, very unsuccessful in terms of the management, and decided to, in desperation, undergo fasting, underwent a 13-day water-only fast, and he went from this to this, and on follow-up to this, and continued to improve. And this was with no medication. Can you tell the difference? He could. As I mentioned, high blood pressure responds to fasting. We have the largest effects that have ever been shown in treating hypertension. We did this study with T. Colin Campbell, 174 consecutive patients with high blood pressure, and 174 people normalized pressure low enough to eliminate medication, with an average effect size of 37 points, and for people with stage 3 hypertension, 60-point drop. And not only that, remember, this is 60 points plus the fact that everybody that was on medications at the start of fasting was off medications by the end of fasting. We'd also worked with borderline hypertension. We did this study, 68 patients with borderline hypertension, high enough to justify concern, but not high enough to justify medication. They also, of course, normalized. Then we did a prospective study with our colleagues at the Mayo Clinic, where we took 27 people that had hypertension, fasted them, and 26 people were able to completely eliminate the use of medication. 26 were able to eliminate their medications entirely. One of them required half-dose medication. You can see that their weights went down with fasting. And then at 1 year follow-up, were sustained. We actually tracked these people at a year. If you look at their body weight, if you look at their systolic blood pressure, and you look at diastolic blood pressure, not only were they able to get well, stay well at the end of fasting at 6-week follow-up, but they're able to sustain that for a year, which suggests that some people that are highly motivated are not only able to make changes, but they can sustain those changes. If you look at their abdominal circumference, was starting here, went down with fasting, a little bit of recovery after fasting, but at 1 year, it was actually lower than it was even at the end of fasting. Medication use followed accordingly. Most people were able to eliminate their need for medication and sustain results. Long COVID, about 10% of people that get COVID don't recover. They have brain fog, they have fatigue, they have all kinds of secondary symptoms. We've been treating those patients, and we've published our first long-term outcome in treating long COVID. This was a 73-year-old man who had 2 years of hell after COVID, severe fatigue, congestion, cough, diarrhea, etc. He underwent 14 days of fasting with a resolution, subsequently got COVID, and had a little flare-up, came back in, did a 10-day fast, and then we were able to demonstrate both short-term and long-term resolution of those symptoms. So 2 years of hell, and now no longer having the brain fog and fatigue. We're also treating a lot of patients with COVID vaccine injury. They get these vaccines, and then they activate their underlying autoimmune disease or cancer, and fortunately, many of them are responding to fasting. And finally, one of the things I'm very excited about, there's something called lipoprotein(a). It's a cardiovascular risk factor for heart disease. It's thought to be untreatable. In other words, Medicare will only pay for you to do this test once because there's no point in retesting because it doesn't go down. No drug will treat it, etc. But what we did is this happened to be a long-standing vegetarian patient who had gained a little weight from eating ultra-processed foods, put him on a 10-day fast with a 6-week follow-up, and not only did his weight go down 10 pounds and his blood pressure normalize, as we would expect, he dropped his lipoprotein(a) 40%. This supposedly untreatable, genetically mediated risk factor doesn't respond to diet alone, but it does respond to fasting. Now, subsequently, I had another long-term vegan patient that was actually at optimum weight, was doing everything right, but had congenital hypercholesteremia and elevated lipoprotein(a). Her lipoprotein(a) was 300. With a 5-day water fast, was able to drop lipoprotein(a) 100 points. Now, subsequently, we were doing a lot of testing with this, and it turns out we're routinely seeing people normalize lipoprotein(a). So we've just published this first case report, and we hope to do a clinical trial that shows that although drugs and even diet alone aren't enough, fasting gets the job done. So in conclusion, we do have a website, and we have a free consultation that we offer with me. If you are interested in knowing whether fasting might be relevant to you, you can complete the registration forms on our website, and then I offer a free phone conversation with me to kind of point you in the right direction. We also have an active telemedicine practice where people can actually talk to a doctor who's not an idiot and get good feedback and result. And you can get access to all of this, including the live streaming we do of our lectures every day at True North Health. You can get free access to that. We don't monetize any of our educational efforts through our website at truenorthhealth.com. We have 3 cookbooks, which are vegan SOS free cookbooks, Bravo, Bravo Express, and the Health Promoting Cookbook. These are recipes that are well tested, and they're simple enough even I can make them. So, I mean, believe me, if I can make them, you can make them. And we also have, of course, our book, The Pleasure Trap, and our new book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? And this is a deep dive into fasting. If you want to know about fasting, Can Fasting Save Your Life is a useful resource.
Wow. That was, as Valerie says, astounding, the information. Thank you so much for sharing this. It's tremendous. It's just unbelievable. So this is the book that tells all about fasting if you want more specific information on that. And then the one that he talked about at the beginning of the video, I wanted to be sure you saw that one again. Remember when he was talking about being caught in the pleasure trap and all the ways that the salt, fat, and sugar grab hold of us and why they do? That's in here too. You remember it is co-authored with Doug Lisle, Dr. Doug Lisle, who is zoomed with us as well. There were a million questions and a million thoughts and lots of laughter and lots of yes, yes. I heard all through our muted backgrounds, and fabulous presentation, says Debbie. I want to ask one question and then we'll ask any others that people would like to put in the chat for us. You had a wonderful chart that talked about the different types of fasting, okay? And I've heard you talk a lot about intermittent fasting and, of course, what you're doing at True North with water fasting. Can you explain to us, I've heard you say everybody should be doing intermittent fasting. Tell us what it is, or if there's any caution.
Sure. So we're really talking about time-restricted feeding. It basically means you want to not eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed. That will give you a 12-hour fast every day. And if you're trying to lose weight, you might even extend that a little bit by delaying your breakfast till you've had a chance to do exercise in the morning. That exercise you do in a fasting state preferentially will mobilize fat at least between 12 and 16 hours. Now, then you have an 8-hour feeding window. But during that 8-hour feeding window, you want to exclusively eat whole plant foods, fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, not meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar. And if you have trouble remembering that, just remember anything that gives you joy or comfort, we want to get rid of. You get nothing.
That sounds mean and hateful to me.
It is mean and hateful sounding, but the reality is the foods that are banging on your nervous system are the drug-like pleasure trap foods, the oil, salt, and sugar. Now, the problem is the average person's getting about 70% of their calories from those foods. So it's a big adjustment, shifting over to eating large volumes of whole natural foods instead of small volumes of ultra-processed foods. But once you eat enough, which is really the key to weight loss, you've got to eat so much salad and steamed vegetables and fruit that there's not much room for the drug-like foods that everybody else is going to try to shove into you. And then you go through the addictive withdrawal initially. And it's not easy. This is, you saw the data. There's a 99% failure rate for BMI over 40. There's a 95% failure rate for all people trying to lose weight because we tell people to lose weight the wrong way. We tell them to eat less of the same foods. It's like trying to get an alcoholic to quit drinking by giving them beer and wine. It doesn't work. You have to do the truth, which is stop eating the chemicals that are fooling your brain. If you do that, you win. And we've seen that at the True North Health Center for 40 years. You know, I've had people come in literally for a year and lose 2 pounds a week every week for a year. So, and if you're a male, it's 3 pounds. Men will lose weight about 50% faster than women. Any husband and wife that go on a diet together will find out really quickly. Men are full of testosterone, which is a fat-burning hormone. If you inject women with testosterone, their fat melts off them. But then they get hairy and get cancer and die, so it's not a good strategy. If you inject men with estrogen, they get fat, they grow breasts, they get hips. These differences between men and women are biological, not psychological. And so what does that mean if you're a woman trying to lose weight? It means you're going to work twice as hard, you're going to get half the results, so you have to get used to it. It's not just with weight loss, it's everything else too. You know it. You don't need me telling you that.
Dr. Goldhamer, what about somebody that is already at a very low BMI? Valerie's
Yes.
asking specifically at 19.7. What would be
Well,
her?
yeah, 19.7 is perfectly fine in terms of fasting. We try not to go much below a BMI of 18. We never go below 16. So if you're thin, you're not going to be doing a marathon 40-day Jesus Christ fast. You're going to be doing a short period of fasting. It might be a couple days or 5 days, or you won't need as much fasting because you likely don't have the consequence of dietary excess. What we do is we take healthy people at their optimum weight and we'll fast them 5 to 7 days. If they're clinically stable, that's it. We're done. We move on to the healthy eating and go on with that. And we recommend that once a year for all healthy people, just a little reboot time, but it's a short time. You're not going to lose substantial amounts of weight. You're going to be able to recover the lean tissue as I said, at 6 weeks, people have all of their lean tissue back. So it's really just the excess fat. Now, the problem is some thin people are still over fat. They're not big, but they're too high a percentage of their body fat's fat. So we're going to fast them, get that fat off, and then rebuild lean tissue. But yes, thin people, if their BMI is below 16, we're not going to do water fasting. If it's between 16 and 18, it's going to be very constricted. But if you have a BMI of 20 or 19, there's certainly no reason you can't fast, particularly if we have no concern about you able to recover the weight after fasting. Now, let's say you have a person who's very skin, they're cachexic, they've got cancer or whatever. That may be a different situation because if you take the weight off them, it may be very difficult to recover. And so you have to modify the program to meet their specific clinical needs. And that's one of the reasons why we offer, a phone conversation with me, because I can review your medical history and kind of point you in the right direction. Is this something you should even be thinking about? How to hook you up with a doctor who's not an idiot that might be able to give you good advice? And, we do that without cost so that people at least get pointed in the right direction.
So, Dr. Goldhamer, first of all, fabulous presentation.
Well, thank you.
So somebody has a very rare cancer. I don't know the name of it, but they've had a lot of organs that they don't need removed, gone through chemo for a long period of time. And I'm just going to say the numbers keep going up.
Yeah.
Is this something that you would even try to work with?
Well, yeah, the thing is, I don't know whether they'll be a candidate for water fasting, but almost everybody is a candidate for healthy eating. And so you want to get the diet right. With cancer, like obesity, there's no cure for obesity. There's no cure for cancer. You can lose the weight and keep it off, but you're not cured. If you go back to doing the greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh processed food diet, you're getting fat again. And so with cancer, you're not curing cancer, you're managing it. It's how can you get the body's immune system to kind of keep it in check as best as possible. And diet, sleep, and exercise are always an important part of that. Sometimes fasting can be helpful. Sometimes it's not appropriate. And so, we don't fast people that aren't appropriate because that would mess up our long-term outcome data. So, that would be a problem.
Okay. Another question. So I wrote down a whole bunch. So is this mostly private pay?
Well, medical insurance that allows you to pick your own medical doctor would pay for the exam and any medical management in the lab. They wouldn't pay to stay at the center. The couple $100 a day it costs to stay in the program wouldn't be covered. Anything that actually gets you well probably won't be covered. But in terms of medical evaluation lab, yeah, that's paid for just like seeing any physician. Medicare will reimburse that, FSAs, all that kind of stuff. So there's a couple $100 a day though to actually stay at the center. What that includes is your room, meals or fasting supervision, twice daily visits with the staff doctors, doing rounds or educational programs, doing your laundry. All those things are all included in the daily rate. So it's very similar to, say, being in a hotel. In fact, some of our patients that are business people that are return patients will stay with us just because it's cheaper than the DoubleTree, and they get their per diem. So it's relatively affordable because we're a 501c3 nonprofit research-based organization that's disguised as a clinic. So we don't have stockholders, we don't have to meet corporate requirements. We're able to keep the rates relatively affordable.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Clyde asks, it seems if I try to fast, I get extremely hungry and overeat later in the day. Would you discuss ways
Yes.
to avoid this?
Yes, so the biggest problem is when you're on a conventional diet, particularly with sugar, your insulin levels go up and that drives the sugar down, and then you get cravings and you get binging, and a lot of this stuff that people are having trouble with, quote, eating disorders, is aggravated by the diet that they're eating and the effect that it has on their insulin levels. When you go on a whole plant food diet, what ends up happening is your blood sugar starts to stabilize. And with fasting, once you get into the fasting state, you actually convert from burning sugar to burning fat. And that's why people don't even have hunger. Not only do they not have cravings, but after a couple of days in a resting state, using fasting. People go to cooking classes. They haven't eaten in 13 days or 21 days. They're going to cooking classes. They come down to the dining room. They're socializing. And you think, oh my God, how could you do that when you haven't eaten for 3 weeks? And yet they have no trouble because they have no hunger. That's one of the mechanisms by which these fasting mimicking diets are working. They put people on the dead Dr. Atkins diet, may his filet of soul rest in peace, on a high-fat, high-protein diet. They get a fasting mimicking effect where it blunts the hunger. It's not a good thing long-term, for mind you, but it does have that hunger blunting effect. And certainly that's true with fasting. Fasting has a hunger blunting effect. Now, you can't fast forever. You have to go back to feeding. But if you go back to feeding a high plant-based diet that will stabilize blood sugar levels, the cravings, the bingings, the issues tend to be mitigated. And fasting reduces the insulin resistance, so it tends to normalize the blood sugar as well. But that's also why we like to do this in a controlled setting. Now, if you go on a whole plant food diet for 2 or 3 weeks, you'll probably find you can do the 12 hours of intermittent fasting without having as much difficulty. You might need to start off with 10 hours and then build it up slowly. And again, if you're having those problems, complete the registration forms on our website. Give me a call and maybe I can talk you through a little strategy individually that might help you, kind of break through that barrier.
And I want to clarify, your goal with water fasting, for whatever reason, is to get us to whole food plant-based SOS, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, without the diet, sleep, and exercise, forget about it. If you're not prepared to do the diet, sleep, and exercise, don't waste your time. Fasting is a useful tool to reestablish a state where hopefully good foods start to taste good. You can get off the toxic medications. You can reverse the pathology so that you're getting healthier fasting, you're getting sick. But it's not like, oh, you fast and then go back on some greasy, slimy, processed crap diet and going to have no, not going to work that way. Health results from healthful living. It's diet, sleep, exercise. Fasting is just a tool to facilitate the transition.
Okay, Valerie asked, does fasting impact heart arrhythmia?
Yes, in fact, potentially in a negative way. Because fasting involves some physiological dehydration, if you're in atrial fibrillation and on anticoagulant therapy, we wouldn't want to just stop the anticoagulant therapy because you could have a pulmonary embolism and throw a stroke. And we don't want to fast on the drug because the drug's effect is going to be altered by fasting. So what we would do is a modified fast. We would use 600 calories of vegetable juice and broth and other things where you could continue to safely take your medication until you get to the point where the need for medication is eliminated. But it may take, post-heart attack, it might take a year before people are stable enough where that they could then wean off their medication.
And Linda asked, are fasting protocols in either or any of your books, or I guess?
Yes, we
if
have.
so, which
Can
ones?
Fasting Save Your Life? This was written not only to convince the layperson about what's involved in fasting, but to also convince their doctor that they're not an idiot because they're asking about it. And it has all of the protocols laid out. So not only for the patient, but also for their doctor. Their doctor would understand what testing needs to be done, what the process of monitoring is, what the concerns are. And so it's written both for the layperson, but it's a really deep dive into fasting. We have a really brilliant director of research for True North Health. Her name is Dr. Tasha Myers, and she's a Columbia University graduate researcher who's able to take really complicated things and make them understandable. And she's the principal author of this book, and she's done a really, really good job of helping explain what can be a fairly complicated subject in a way that all of us can understand.
Okay, Laura asked, can someone fast and still work?
No. If your work involves vigorous activity or driving, or you're not going to be working. But if your work involves, say, remote working from home, yes, some of our patients are able to do some activity during fasting. But generally, fasting is thought to be best if you try to rest as much as possible. For example, though, I have some patients that have to do some activity in order to maintain, their businesses and their traders, their whatever it is, and they will successfully undergo fasting and still be able to carry on some activities during the day. But it wouldn't be driving a car, for example, going to work, dealing with, that type of thing. Also, really stressful activities like dealing with, teenagers, probably not the best thing. So, you want to try to be in a restful state as much as possible.
I want to
But we have doctors that do some remote fasting supervision with people that are willing to, or in an environment where they can get the kind of rest they need. They have the condition and history that supports that. We do fasting at True North Health Center. We also do have doctors that will provide remote fasting in conjunction with your local doctor.
And I want to be sure I understand, water fasting for a length of time should be done under medical supervision, correct?
It's always done under medical supervision, but we do it at True North Health Center where you're seen twice a day by staff doctors, et cetera. There are some patients, though, that are good candidates. We'll do remote fasting with them in conjunction with their local doctor. Their local doctor does the exam and lab. Our doctors communicate with them once a day or more if necessary. And they're able to monitor the shorter fasts successfully remotely. That's for people that are, have appropriate histories. Will help you differentiate those patients.
Dr. Goldhamer, I have a question. Does the fasting, does it help with mental health issues, say depression, anxiety? How does
It's a
that
really
work?
good question. And I'm so glad you asked that because I didn't really address that yet. But there's an interesting book out there called Anatomy of an Epidemic. And Anatomy of an Epidemic talks about how the use of serotonin uptake inhibitors has created an epidemic of mental illness. By deactivating the D2 receptors in the brain, these drugs make a person dependent. And then when they try to stop the drugs, they get acute anxiety and depression. And we do a lot of work with helping people wean off these medications, undergo fasting, and then do the diet and lifestyle changes. And what's exciting is that many of our patients with chronic histories of depression and anxiety feel better off all the medications on this program than they ever did on the drugs. And so we've had a very good success rate at helping people eliminate the drugs. The problem is you have to do it very carefully, and you can't just be a cowboy about it, because too rapid withdrawal can really crash a person. But if you're willing to be patient and work with your mental health providers, cognitive behavioral therapy actually works as well as medication when it's done properly. You can get people to where they can stabilize and then be healthy. The problem is you also have to work on the environment. It's not just the diet. Some people don't do as well with inordinate amounts of stress, and so you have to help them develop a lower stress environment. Some people find even things like commuting, and they're driving 2 hours a day to a job they hate, working with people they despise for a company they detest, doing things they don't believe in. That's not good for mental health. So we try to get people to refocus so that their life can be such that the need for exogenous agents can be reduced. So it's more than just changing the diet. But if you're willing to change the diet, if you're willing to get exercise, if you're willing to overcome the sleep deprivation, if you're willing to do things like, relaxation techniques or other stuff, most people with chronic anxiety and depression are able to get dramatic improvement and eventually eliminate the need for medication.
Great, thank you.
We are running out of time, but we have one more question. You've talked about this, the refeeding process. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's what you do.
Yes, it takes half the length of the fast to refeed. So a 20-day fast would take 10 days of controlled refeeding. You start with usually fruit and vegetable juices, then whole fruit and vegetables, and then increasing caloric density. It's very important that the refeeding be done properly, or you can end up with post-fasting edema, refeeding syndrome. It can be a very serious problem, especially a longer fast. That refeeding is one of the most important things that need to be done. That's why we like to do it in a controlled setting. But if it is done at home, that's going to be one of the critical issues, that you follow the protocol. But that's all laid out very explicitly in Can Fasting Save Your Life?
Okay. And before we let you get away, we want to say thank you. I want to be respectful of your time, but my goodness, you are a super presenter and author, and you are the leader in water fasting in the world. And I know that must cause stress. So we're sending you a stress ball. And in fact, you may have gotten it already. I don't know. And it's
wonderful.
In this little ball you squeeze, and when you do, these lavender smells that explode out into the air, and flaxseed. So we hope you enjoy.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We can't thank
you. But I actually believe that stress is like Christmas. It's better to give than receive. So I try to be generous.
Okay, well, Dr. Goldhamer, we are respectful of your time. So if you want to go ahead and leave now, we're going to do a real quick what's next coming up on our agenda. And thank you again. Everybody kept saying in the comments, wonderful presentation and laughter. Oh, thank you. This was great. Okay, so let's move on to what's coming up next. Well, first of all, this video will be on YouTube. And that's the Chat and Chew More Plants. It'll probably be up the end of this week. You can use the QR code to get to the YouTube channel now, and and subscribe and mark that you want notifications when it does come up. In the chat box, Linda is putting the link to it as well, so that will be there for you. And for those of you that were with us last Friday night to see Jane Esselstyn in person, hers is going to be up on Monday probably, and that's the QR code for that as well. And so that same link to the QR page will be there. Debbie, can you tell us real quick, maybe something that they might hear if they were to watch Jane's YouTube?
Oh, they're just going to hear a lot of great stuff. Jane was very, very exciting. She made some great food. She shares how she prepares the recipes, and you'll just have a good time. So you've got to watch it, folks. I'm not giving it away.
Oh, and Debbie, we've got another session coming up. Let me see. Can you tell us what's coming up in February?
Yes, so Dr. Laurie Marbus, she is awesome, awesome, awesome. She's going to be talking about lab work. As plant-based eaters, you know, we see a lot of differences in our labs, you know, a lot of changes and stuff. So what does that mean? What does it mean as far as risk and risk reduction? And this is going to be a fabulous presentation. You bring your labs, and you know what? I'm sure she'll be able to answer your questions. So don't be square, be there.
Okay, Debbie. That's the QR code for it, and Linda will put that in the chat box. And then the last thing is, so you'll know what's coming up in the future and you can put it on your calendar. We have a calendar online, and that's the QR code for it. We still have 3 more speakers besides Dr. Marbus for this year that finishes in May. And Linda's putting the link up to the calendar. If you want to get our newsletter to be aware of the new things that are happening, we put one out once a month via email, and Linda will put that link in there as well. And then the last thing we have for you is our podcast, and you'll want to listen to what's up there this month. Cindy, who introduced Dr. Goldhamer, she is featured in it along with Dr. Doug Lisle and things from the pleasure trap. So it goes really well with what we saw today. And I think it will give you more insights and also refresh your memory of what you've learned from him.